All right, welcome to the Palm Springs Air Museum, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Greg Kenny, and I am the education coordinator here. I wanted to take a few minutes to chat with you and share with you what it is that we talk about when we have students come and visit the Palm Springs Air Museum and we give them a presentation on the history and science of flight. We like to give a little background to students that maybe don't have aviation experience. We like to talk about the history of flight going back to not only the beginning of aircraft, but also hot air balloons and things like that. So if you have a few minutes to spend with me, let's take a look and listen and see what you think. I want to start off by saying, of course, welcome to our students and welcome to everybody that's watching with us today. There's our P-51 Mustang going by. And I like to remind students that it's probably a pretty safe bet to say that as long as there's been humans walking around the earth, there's probably been humans that have wanted and have dreamed about flying. And they've thought to themselves, well, what could I do to make myself be able to fly? How could I achieve flight? And the obvious thing to turn toward or to think about is, all right, well, what works for the birds? What do the birds have that make them able to fly? And obviously they look at their feathers, right? And you know, we've got stories going back to Icarus, one of these early stories of early man, and it talks about a person collecting feathers and using wax to make the feathers stick to his body, and he tried to jump and flap his arms to fly. Now, that didn't work out very well. As we know, our bodies aren't made to fly just with feathers. The big difference between the human body and the bird's body, the bird's skeleton, is largely the fact that our bones are heavy and they're made to do great things for us, like climb trees and fall out and ride bicycles and fall off and things like that. But a bird's body is made for flying, and so their skeleton is lighter, not as robust, not as strong as ours. And the inside of their feathers, you can see here when you're up close to one, it's almost hollow. It's strong enough to carry the weight of the bird, but light enough to enable it to get off the ground. So when humans were thinking these things through, they very quickly came to the conclusion that it just wasn't going to be feathers that would make us able to fly. We'd have to add a little something else. And we can go back in history, we can go back quite a ways and find some examples of different ideas that people were trying and thinking about. If we go back to the 14 and the 1500s, and we go back to Leonardo da Vinci, for example, we can see one person that was really kind of obsessed with this idea of flight. Now, he was obsessed with a lot of things. He was an incredibly creative and an imaginative person. He was an artist, a sculptor, and he invented all kinds of different machines or ideas for machines. And one of the things he was thinking about was this little gizmo here. If you want to take a look at this, this was his idea of something that would sort of resemble what today I think we would think about as a helicopter. Now, it doesn't really look like a helicopter to us per se, but with a little imagination, this would be the propeller on the top that would spin. Now remember, he's living in the 1500s, so there's no such thing as a gasoline engine. What he's got is, he's got wood, he's got fabric, and he's also got animal power. So he thinks to himself, well, perhaps if we had an animal that could run around at the base here, turning the wheel that would turn this corkscrew-looking thing, this propeller sort of deal, perhaps we could turn it fast enough to get it to raise itself off the ground, or perhaps if we dropped it and it would catch the wind, it would slowly spin down. Perhaps that would work. I wouldn't want to try that. I don't think it would have been incredibly successful. However, it is a great example of people thinking about machines that could fly. Now, Da Vinci also thought about other machines such as gliders. There's a little picture up behind me here. And those were both machines that we consider heavier than air. So they'd have to float along on the air currents, but they were heavier than the air itself. And it really wasn't until some years later that humans really were able to achieve sustained flight. By sustained, I mean able to stay in the air for a longer period of time. And it wasn't one of these helicopter gizmos, and it really wasn't a glider, but it was another type of machine, a lighter than air machine, that achieved sustained flight. And that came along when we came up with the hot air balloon. Hot air balloon was invented in France by a couple of brothers. Now, this wasn't the guys that invented the airplane. This was a different set of brothers, the Montgolfier brothers. 1783, these brothers are hanging around the campfire. They realize that, you know what, the smoke tends to travel in a consistently upward direction. What if we were able to capture that smoke in a bag and hold on to it somehow, or perhaps attach a basket underneath, experimentation, of course. And they did that exact thing. They experimented. And they realized after some period of time that it really wasn't necessarily the smoke that they needed to capture, because we don't call it a smoke air balloon, do we? We call it a hot air balloon. It was the hot air. The hot air travels upward. If we're going to try to find the warmest air in the room, it's going to be on the ceiling, the coolest toward the floor. And they realized, hey, if we are able to capture a platform and build a fire on it, a bag is attached over the top, we capture that hot air, we will travel up with the hot air. Now, one of the little experiments we like to do here in the Palm Springs Air Museum is we like to create our own hot air balloon. I'm going to bring one over to the table here and demonstrate. So here we are. I've got just a very generic plastic bag here, and hanging underneath it, for the purposes of an example, I've got a rooster, a sheep, and a duck, a picture of them, just to kind of show you what the first passengers in the hot air balloon looked like. People were a little scared. Those Montgolfier brothers back in the 1700s thought, you know what, why don't we put some animals in there to go flying for the first trip? And if they could make it back safely, well, it's probably safe enough for us. And so that's what they tried. So what we'll do is we'll spread the bag. Now, like we said, in order for us to achieve flight, we need to heat the air inside the bag. So here we go. I've got my little propane torch there, butane. Now, you don't see smoke coming off of that, right? Because we're just burning the gas. So there's definitely heat being created, but not really smoke. And so if we can get that heat to travel up inside the bag, hopefully on camera there, you can see it inflating, and you'll actually see it lift off the table and out of screen. And so went the first flight. First hot air balloon flight flies out and comes back when the air inside the bag cools. And now we've got sustained human flight. As long as we can keep that fire going into the bag, we can stay up in the air. Now that's a good way to fly. It's a fun way to see things. People still fly around in these, especially here in the desert, even today. But when we think about hot air balloons and travel and human beings wanting to go long distances, we start to wonder if that's really the most efficient way to get from one place to another, and what problems might we encounter. And we think about hot air balloons. Do we have complete control over their direction of travel? Yes, we control up and down by how much heat we put in the bag. But do we control which direction we travel? If it's a very windy day and the wind is blowing west, but we want to go east, well, we're probably going to be going west regardless of which direction we'd like to go. So people kind of continued to keep thinking about these things and working on them and improving like human beings will do, trying to make things better all the time. And after a while, they started coming up with other lighter-than-air machines. Here's an example of an airship or a zeppelin. And if you can see on the picture there behind me, the zeppelin, they're very large. They need the very large flying machines. And actually, they contain several bags of gas on the inside of them. It wasn't just one large balloon, but in fact, several independent chambers. People were able to ride on the inside of them, travel great distances, travel all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, for example. And it was a very luxurious way to travel back in the early 1900s. In fact, the average cost for a trip from Paris to New York, I've often heard, was equal to about what one person made in an entire year, the average person. So it was a very wealthy person's way to travel. But obviously, it would have been a lot of fun with one kind of glaring exception. Instead of using hot air, they were using a type of gas. It was a hydrogen gas, and it was lighter than air, so it made the airship or the zeppelin float. But then we encounter another problem, and something that we think about a lot today when we're talking about flying machines, and that's safety. If you're flying and the chief thing keeping you up in the air is an explosive gas, that could be a problem. And in fact, it was a very real problem. In 1937, there was an accident when one of these airships was coming into Lakehurst, New Jersey, the Hindenburg. And people still talk about this today, but anyway, there was a leak of the gas, and with the electricity in the air, static electricity, an explosion occurred. And unfortunately, the Zeppelin crashed to the ground. Not everybody was able to survive that crash. So it was kind of a sad thing, and it kind of got people thinking, you know what, flying is great, but if it's not safe, I think I'll stay on the ground. And so we go back to the drawing board again, and we talk about some other flying machines lighter than air. Now, we've seen the Goodyear blimp flying around the desert here before and over sporting events, and again, a great way to fly. And we've overcome this idea of control by adding engines. The Zeppelin had engines, and the Goodyear blimp has engines, and so you can sort of steer it, so you can go where you want to go. It's not overly speedy. You know, if you want to go to Australia and take a blimp, I think you'd really have quite a journey on your hands. But it is a good way to fly. Is it the best way? Well, you're a little bit limited. You can see the gondola underneath there. It's not terribly big, so you couldn't take hundreds of people. The weight would be a problem. Like I said, the speed is kind of an issue. So we go back to the drawing board again and see if maybe there's another way to fly. Now, before we move on from that, I do like to note, you know, everybody at their birthday party probably has a balloon that they float, right? Now, those balloons are not filled with hydrogen like that Zeppelin was. They're filled with helium, just like the blimps today. And in fact, you know what would be possible? If you had enough balloons, you could tie them to yourself and probably fly. If your camera is working well enough, let's see, can we pick up the little floating kid there on the screen? So that would work pretty well. Anyway, so that's an idea, but let's start thinking about other ways to fly. Now, we want to have control. We want to be safe, but we also want to move fast. And this is where we transition from these lighter than air machines into another idea. And these heavier than air machines that do something a little different. Instead of trying to float along on the air currents, they're actually going to have a way to move themselves. And we start with the glider. The gliders, like we said, are going back all the way to Leonardo da Vinci. The machines that kind of look like this, and some of them worked a little bit, and some of them didn't work much at all. And things like this that are still flying today. And even if we're talking about World War II, they used gliders. They were towed behind airplanes that could carry, a couple dozen troops on the inside, or a jeep, or an artillery piece. So these were really still kind of a functional military tool going back into the 1940s. Now, if we want to get to really the crux of the matter, what really changed everything when it came to flying, that of course is going to take us into these guys, the Wright Brothers. In 1903, the Wright Brothers invented, as we know, the first airplane. I've got a model over here. It's kind of interesting. Now, I think it's important to note, and it's a good example for all of us, that the Wright brothers didn't just wake up one morning and invent the airplane. They were bicycle builders by trade. That was their business. And they started building kites and gliders as a hobby. And they built bigger kites and bigger gliders. In my picture here, you can see them flying a glider there. There's no engine on it. And they were working out these issues of control and things like that. And realizing also that, hey, we're getting tired of climbing to the top of this sand dune over here and jumping off. Wouldn't it be nice if we could take off from level ground and fly? And so that's when they came up with the idea of adding an engine, which they built themselves, and propellers, which they carved themselves, attached to bicycle chains, turning the propeller, each propeller turning in the opposite direction to balance the torque. They were worried about all these things. They were worried about weight. The engine and the pilot only had one pilot, sat next to each other. The engine weighed a little bit more, so it had to have a little bit longer wing to give this side enough lift to carry the offset weight. So there are all these things that they had to figure out. And that's where it kind of comes into a bit of the science, if we're going to talk about how that was working out. And there's a picture of the very first flight. They did fly for about 100, the first flight was in December 17th of 1903. The first flight wasn't very long, it was only about 120 feet. But it was a monumentous thing as far as history goes. Everything that we know about aviation today, in terms of aircraft and even into space travel, started there with the Wright Brothers and what they had figured out. And what did they figure out? Well, they figured out this idea about air pressure. Instead of being lighter than air with a gas or with hot air traveling upwards, they figured out this idea of air pressure, and we can demonstrate it here. We use these scientific tools, also known to you folks as plungers. So I put one here on the desk. You can see that it's just a kind of a regular plunger with a short handle. I wouldn't use it for its traditional function with that short handle. But if we put it on the table and push the air out of it, it'll stick to the table. In fact, it'll stick to the table so well that I can lift the table. And the only thing that's causing it to do that is air pressure. There's 14.7 pounds every square inch of air pressure pushing down on this plunger, trying to get in. When the air is pushed out, the air is trying to be pulled back in, and that gravity pulling the air down around it is causing it to stick to my table. If I do something to release or to relieve that air pressure, then it loses its suction. Now I moved it over to the middle of my table where I have a hole in the table. The air gets in easily, and the plunger is able to be lifted off the table much more easily. Now if we apply that to aircraft, what we're thinking about is air pressure holding up the wing and actually keeping the airplane in the air based on that pressure. Here we go. The shape of the wing. And this is something that the Wright brothers had figured out. If you have a rounded top surface and a flat bottom surface, you have a constant air pressure underneath the bottom on that flat surface. But on the rounded part of the top, the air pressure as it moves over the wing is less. So it's not pushing down as hard on the top as it is holding it up on the bottom. And if you have less pressure on the top and more on the bottom, the natural thing for it to do is to be traveling upward or to be held upward. And that's what they determined. And they even likened it to the shape of a bird's wing. So this is something that they figured out, but they also were thinking about, okay, so we're overcoming gravity. Gravity is our enemy with our wings, and the wings giving us lift. But in order for the wings to work, we also have to have the air moving very quickly over and underneath them. An airplane just doesn't jump straight up into the air. So we have to have some way of creating movement. And that's where we come to this idea of drag and thrust. Most of us have put our hand out of a car window before and had it blown back, right? This idea of drag. If you turn your hand sideways, then you have less drag and your hand moves much more easily. And the idea of thrust is the idea to move forward. So drag is our enemy and thrust is what we want to achieve. And if we think about drag and thrust, I think it's easier for us to understand if we think about a school bus compared to like a sports car, like our Lamborghini over here. A school bus certainly has a much bigger engine than a Lamborghini does. The engine's almost half the size of the whole car, probably. But the school bus is in no way able to go as fast as a Lamborghini, right? It can move more weight, but it certainly can't achieve the same speed. It's got that big flat front that slows it down, has all those kids on the inside that add the weight. So when we're thinking about aircraft, we think along the lines of the Lamborghini, right? We want it to be smooth so the air flows over it equally and quickly. We don't necessarily need the biggest engine, but we do need to have that smooth airflow. We also start to think about, okay, in a car, an engine's attached to the wheels, and the wheels move on the ground, and the car moves. But that doesn't necessarily apply in the air, right? The wheels aren't doing us any good once we're flying. So we have to attach the engine to something else to create movement. And that's where this idea that the Wright brothers were working on with the propeller. Here's a little model here. An engine not attached to the wheels just spin freely. But the engine, if I turn the battery on here, still creates movement because of that propeller on the front, cutting through the air, pushing the car along slightly. But that's the basic idea. Now, of course, this would need to be moving faster, but also need to have wings to get off the ground. So here we go, the whole thing in action. And why do airplanes' wheels fold up? Well, you're decreasing drag. You don't want the air hitting those wheels and slowing your airplane down, so you fold the wheels up. You have the propeller creating thrust and the wings creating lift. And there you have your basic forces of flight. You're using that air pressure under the wing to hold you up and the propeller to keep you moving. Now what if you don't have a propeller? Now most of us today maybe haven't never flown on an airplane that has a propeller. But many of us have seen or flown on aircraft that have a jet engine. And what a jet engine is doing is using a similar idea to create thrust. The propeller, or the fan blades in this case, are on the inside of the jet engine, and they're drawing in the air. They draw the air in, they mix it with fuel, and then they release that pressure out the back. And when they release the pressure, it's enabling the pressure that's pushing forward to move the aircraft. And the best example I can show you, just the simple thing I can show you, is here with the balloon. If anyone that's ever blown air into a balloon and let it go, it kind of goes all over the place, right? But it's a kind of a similar idea to a jet engine. It takes in air, it compresses it, it mixes it with fuel, causing a miniature explosion, and then releases that pressure in a controlled fashion. So let me see if I can just do a little simple example of that here. So here we are, I've got a balloon inside of a bag here. Let's see if we can fill that up. All right, so we'll take it over to about there, and if I were to let it go, it's going to do what? Travel right along. Now thankfully, in a jet, that balloon gets filled continually, over and over, millions of times a minute, and that's what enables that jet engine to keep creating the thrust that moves us through the air. So there we have it. The four forces of flight. And these are important. We always ask our students to commit these to memory as we walk around the museum and talk about the aircraft and how they work. We've got gravity, which is defeated by lift, or the wings. Drag, which wants to hold us back. We overcome that with our smooth, streamlined design, and thrust. When we're talking about smooth and streamlined design, it's kind of interesting to look at air moving over an object. Let's see, a little example here. What I've got inside of here is a blow dryer, and it's going to blow air out through the tube here. I'm going to put a ball over the top of it. And think about how the air is going to move around the ball and enable it to stay up, if it will stay up. Air coming out of here, moving equally around the ball, because the ball is a perfectly round surface. And the only place that doesn't have the pressure on it from the air is on the top. So there, it's held perfectly in place by that tunnel of air. Now, if we were to try to do the same thing with a ball that isn't quite round, say for example with some flat surfaces like this styrofoam ball here, I don't think we'd be able to achieve the same result. Likewise with a golf ball, although it is round, it does have the little divots in it, and it's also quite a bit heavier than a ping pong ball. And I don't know about you guys, but when I'm flying, I like to fly a little higher off the ground than that. So all these things to be considered when we're thinking about aircraft design and functionality, how they're going to work. Even if we take a look at a wiffle ball here, round shape, but then we have the problem of the holes and the air coming in. It stays in the chamber of air pretty well, but the problem is with the holes, it causes it to spin. Another thing I wouldn't really be wowed about if I was taking a flight. Gravity, lift, drag, and thrust. Those are the four forces of flight that you really should have firmly implanted in your mind if you're thinking about what actually causes an aircraft to fly. All right. So here we are. I'm kind of coming to the end of our presentation, but I feel like this is actually one of the more important parts, and it's the part that I really try to emphasize with our students that we remember as we walk around the Air Museum, looking at particularly the military aircraft, and is what is the most important part, the essential aspect, and I like to say the most irreplaceable part of any aircraft. And a lot of times in this case, I'll have students raise their hand and tell me, oh, it's the wings that are the most important, or the propeller. And all those are obviously vital ingredients in the creation of an airplane, but those are all parts, and for the most part, they're replaceable. But when we get to my friends over here, I think we'd all agree that it's the human beings that are irreplaceable and completely essential. Even if we're talking about drone aircraft being flown today for military purposes, you still have human beings that obviously have to design them and build them, maintain them, and operate them and make the crucial decisions on how they work. So the human beings are the part, especially if we're looking back at aircraft from World War II and even modern day aircraft with pilots, the human beings that are in them, we have to think about their safety and have to think about their comfort, because they're controlling machines that are very complicated in some cases. So they have to be able to think clearly and do their jobs. So we do like to talk about some of the human aspects that we have to think about for our pilots. Obviously, pilots from World War II wearing flight suits and flight jackets, trying to keep them protected in the event there would be an emergency, and also in the cold temperatures that they had to deal with in many cases. Should there be an emergency type case, of course, you've got your life jacket, your parachute. At the altitude, sometimes, especially if we're talking about the bombers, we're up 30,000 feet, so you've got oxygen. You've got the headgear so you can communicate with other people on the aircraft as well as other aircraft. And then we move into more modern pilots, like the one I have next to me here, that he's actually got his flight suit on and his G suit, which would enable him to have the blood in his legs and his extremities squeezed into the middle of his body when he's flying, because he's flying at such speeds that if the blood were to rush to his feet, he would actually lose consciousness, and that wouldn't be a good thing for a pilot. Now, he's got a much more robust helmet, but still wearing the oxygen mask. All these things that we have to think about in order to keep our pilots safe. We've done an awful lot to make sure our pilots are trained. You don't just send a pilot into an aircraft without teaching him or her how to fly it, how everything operates. Obviously, these are people, and this is something that we like to emphasize, these are people that have worked and studied very hard. Being a pilot is obviously a job that has to be taken very seriously. And so if you're going to learn how to do that, and oftentimes you have other people's lives in your hands that are flying in your aircraft. So it's important that they pay attention, they know how everything works, and they take their job seriously. We do like to point out that really the important part is that hard work and effort.
Hello.
Now, at certain times in our country's history, there were times when women were thought not to be capable of being pilots. Now, today we know much better than that. And it was those women, many women from World War II, that helped us learn those lessons. The WASPs, for example, Women's Air Force Service Pilots. African Americans at one point were thought not able to be pilots. That clearly was a very wrong thing that our country was confused about. Early in World War II, folks like the Tuskegee Airmen taught us some real strong lessons about that with their extreme heroism and becoming some real heroes. So really having nothing to do with what you look like, where you come from, but having to do with how hard that you work, how much you believe in yourself and want to do something that you feel passionate about. And that's what we really try to instill with our students. So here I come to the end of my presentation. I hope I've enlightened everybody a little bit today, or given you something to talk about or even disagree with. I'm fine with that too. I encourage everybody to please come and visit the Air Museum sometime. We'd love to have you here. My name is Greg Kinney. I'm the Education Coordinator for the Palm Springs Air Museum. Thank you very much for your time.